Hello, friends! In the late 8th century BC, widespread drought caused by a shift in monsoon patterns led to a mass migration of people from the Fertile Crescent into the Mediterranean region. When they arrived, they brought with them new technologies for growing crops and making weapons. These new technologies gave them an advantage over the indigenous people of the Mediterranean, who had never before experienced such intense competition for resources. Many of the native populations were wiped out, while others were enslaved or forced to flee. This sudden shift in power completely changed the course of history, setting in motion events that would eventually lead to the rise of Rome and the Greek empires, and it all happened because of changes in the climate. This is the story of the catastrophic collapse. If you enjoy this video, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss another episode. Before we dive into today's video, I want to let you know about my newsletter. I recently started writing a weekly newsletter covering topics related to ancient history and mythology, ranging from philosophy to religion to art and literature. It's a great way to support me and my work, and it's a lot of fun to write. You can find the link to the newsletter below. And now, let's get back to today's video. Before we get into the drastic effects this climate change had on the Mediterranean societies, we must first look at what caused it. Recent research has uncovered evidence that around 1200 BC, the monsoon system shifted dramatically. Monsoons are seasonal wind shifts that cause dramatic increases in rainfall during certain times of the year. They are responsible for the lush vegetation and rich soils found throughout the Fertile Crescent. But monsoons are also fickle and prone to sudden shifts that can last for decades or even centuries. One of the most pronounced effects of the shift was the expansion of the Sahara Desert. As the monsoon system changed, the amount of rainfall in North Africa plummeted. Over time, the Sahara began to transform from a land of rolling grasslands and small lakes into a dry and arid desert. But while the Sahara was becoming drier, the eastern Mediterranean was experiencing record rainfall. In fact, some scholars believe that this period of increased rainfall may have been the direct result of human activity. Around 1200 BC, the population of the Fertile Crescent was booming, and many of these people were pastoralists, meaning they made their living raising large herds of animals. All those animals produce a lot of waste, and one of the key components of that waste is nitrogen. Between 1200 and 1100 BC, more nitrogen was released into the atmosphere than is released in a normal year today. That much nitrogen caused massive algae blooms in the Mediterranean, which blocked out the sun and lowered temperatures across the region. The air grew colder and rainier, creating the perfect environment for Mycenaean Greece to flourish. Mycenae was located on the Peloponnese, a small peninsula jutting out from mainland Greece. Throughout the late Bronze Age, Mycenae was home to the richest and most powerful city-states in Greece. Unlike the rest of Greece, Mycenae experienced very little drought and the people flourished. By contrast, the Minoans of Crete experienced devastating droughts and their society collapsed. In fact, the only reason Mycenae thrived during this period is because the Minoan king sent his best soldiers to conquer the Peloponnese. Without that distraction, the Mycenaean kings could easily have been defeated by their neighbors. As the climate continued to shift, the rains grew heavier and more frequent, leading to massive flooding. By 1170 BC, a massive flood devastated the entire eastern Mediterranean. Entire cities were wiped off the face of the earth, including the Mycenaean city of Pylos. In total, it is estimated that between 1190 and 1150 BC, the population of the eastern Mediterranean fell by as much as 70%. Whatever prosperity the Mycenaeans enjoyed before 1170 BC was now gone, and they entered the so-called Greek Dark Ages, a period of poverty and obscurity that lasted for the next 4 centuries. But as bad as things were getting in Mycenae, they were even worse for the people living in the Levant. The exact location of the Fertile Crescent, the region that encompasses modern-day Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Palestine, and Egypt, the Fertile Crescent was where agriculture was first domesticated. For thousands of years, it was the breadbasket of the ancient world, feeding the Egyptians, Mesopotamians, and later the Greeks and Romans. But after 1200 BC, the Fertile Crescent was devastated by drought. The once lush and fertile land became dry and barren, forcing its inhabitants to abandon their homes and flee to other regions. Some headed north into Anatolia, where they encountered the Hittite Empire. Others traveled south into Egypt, where they encountered the New Kingdom. Both kingdoms were happy to accept the newcomers since they were desperate for labor. However, neither kingdom offered freedom. The refugees were forced into slavery, which led to massive social upheaval within both empires. The Hittites ruled over Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, during the Late Bronze Age. At its peak, the empire stretched from the Aegean Sea in the west to the Persian Gulf in the east and from the Black Sea in the north to the Mediterranean in the south. Unfortunately for the Hittites, their empire was built on the backs of slaves, meaning any disruption to their slave supply would be disastrous. With the sudden influx of refugees, the Hittites were able to maintain their dominance over Anatolia. However, the refugees weren't grateful. Instead, they rebelled and fought against their Hittite oppressors. Eventually, the Hittite Empire would collapse, and their reason for doing so is unknown. But scholars agree that the influx of Anatolian refugees played some role. Ancient Egypt was founded in 3100 BC and endured for nearly 3,000 years. Despite its longevity, the Egyptian Empire was not immune to collapse. In fact, it collapsed twice in the span of a single century. The Second Intermediate Period took place between 1650 and 1550 BC, when Egypt was occupied by the Hyksos. The Hyksos were a group of foreign rulers who invaded Egypt from the east. They were led by a man named Saucon, who seized control of Thebes and made himself pharaoh. Saucon's reign marked the beginning of the end for ancient Egypt. Although the Hyksos were eventually driven out, the damage was already done. The Egyptian Empire was never the same. Now imagine that, but instead of lasting for 3,000 years, Egyptian civilization only lasted for 300. That is exactly what happened during the Greek Dark Ages. After the devastating floods of 1170 BC, Greece was plunged into darkness. The Mycenaean palaces were destroyed and the population was decimated. Literacy disappeared and trade networks collapsed. Even worse, the Dorians, a nomadic tribe from the north, invaded Greece and conquered everything in sight. By 1000 BC, Greece was a shadow of its former self. However, this wasn't the end for the Greeks. A few hundred survivors fled to the islands of the Aegean Sea, where they regrouped and began planning their revenge. One of the refugees was a man named Hellen, who managed to escape to the island of Sparta. Hellen was a handsome young man with an incredible charm. He spent his days training the Spartan youth and telling stories about the glory of Mycenaean Greece. Soon enough, all of the Dorian leaders wanted him for themselves, but Hellen refused to be anyone's slave. Instead, he pretended to be willing to submit to the highest bidder. He accepted gifts and fine clothes from each leader until he had enough wealth to raise an army. Hellen then assembled his elite force of warriors and marched across Greece, kicking out the Dorians and reuniting the Greek people under the banner of Sparta. Hellen ruled over Greece for several decades, restoring prosperity and peace to the land. After his death, the Greeks flourished and eventually expanded beyond the Peloponnese. They defeated the Phrygians, reclaimed the islands of the Aegean, and launched a series of raids into the heartland of the Hittite Empire. By 800 BC, the Greeks were firmly back on top and their future looked brighter than ever. Unfortunately, the same couldn't be said about their neighbors, the Assyrians. Although Hellen successfully drove the Dorians out of Greece, his victory didn't go over well with everyone. The Dorians were actually a subgroup of a larger Indo-European tribe known as the Aeolians. The Aeolians were furious that the Spartans dared to challenge their authority and vowed revenge. Aeolian tribesmen abandoned their homes and prepared for war. Each tribe brought with them elite warriors and terrifying new weapons. The Spartans simply weren't prepared for what was coming. Over the next several decades, the Spartans and Aeolians fought a series of brutal battles across northern Greece. The Spartans won the first few engagements, But the Aeolians quickly adapted to their tactics and turned the tide of war. The Spartans realized they were in trouble and desperately needed help. So they reached out to their old enemies, the Phoenicians. For several decades, the Spartans and Phoenicians waged war against the Aeolians, but neither side could claim victory. But just when it seemed like the war would turn into a stalemate, the Assyrian Empire attacked. The Assyrians were an evil empire located in northern Mesopotamia. They are perhaps best known for their brutality, but they were also masters of military strategy and organization. Their generals like Baal-Benu and Shamsi-Adad V led their armies to victory after victory, conquering vast swaths of the Middle East. Unfortunately for the Greeks, the Assyrians were more than happy to intervene in their civil war. With the aid of the Assyrians, the Spartans finally defeated the Aeolians and pushed them into the mountains of northern Greece. There the Aeolians would eventually become known as the Thebans. But that would be centuries into the future. For now, the Spartans emerged victorious, thanks in part to the Assyrians. But there was one major problem. The Spartans were supposed to be allied with the Assyrians, but in the middle of the war, the Spartans switched sides and joined the Persians. The Spartans had switched sides for two reasons. First, the Spartans had grown tired of being at war. Since 1170 BC, the Peloponnese had been in constant conflict. By 800 BC, everyone was just ready for it to be over. Second, the Persians treated the Spartans far better than the Assyrians did. The Persians understood the value of the Spartans and showered them with gifts. In fact, the Spartans loved their Persian gifts so much that they adopted Persian customs and even intermarried with Persian nobles. Soon enough, the Spartans were completely under the influence of the Persians. Now, if you don't know much about ancient Persian history, I've got good news for you. I recently finished recording my series on the Persians, which covers everything from Cyrus the Great to Xerxes. So please click the link above and watch the series today, and thank you for watching.